We are talking MEGABOA. This one is directed by Mario N. Bonasin and stars Eric Roberts, who is fast becoming the new Danny Trejo, being in all these low-budget films. And this is an asylum movie, and it kind of feels like it should have come out between 2000 and 2010. It's kind of one of these era kind of giant CGI monster films that I thought we were kind of done with in the kind of recent years, but here we are, apparently not. So MEGABOA is kind of similar to the plot of the movie Anaconda. I guess that movie's been out a while. The asylum thinks people won't have seen it. That's the original idea. That's all cool. But anyway, let's discuss what the plot is here. So we have a group of students, and they're kind of, I guess, a university lecturer played by Eric Roberts, go to this kind of South American island to do some type of kind of research there. However, this kind of island is home to a giant boa constrictor, as well as some other giant creatures as well. And it just so happens at this time there's a couple of kind of poachers on this island as well. And everyone kind of gets mixed up in a fight for survival against this giant snake. What'll happen? Well, you're going to have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. So, in case you are unfamiliar, The Asylum is a independent film studio that is kind of renowned for making very, very cheap movies. A lot of them try to kind of emulate blockbuster films. This one's a little late to the party if it's trying to kind of do a mockbuster of Anaconda, but whatever. So, what can we say that works? What is there? Is there any kind of pluses in this movie? Actually, I would say there is. Asylum films generally tend to be fairly formulaic, and that's fair to say of this film as well. But there isn't to say that there's not some enjoyment to be had there if you can be somewhat accepting of just kind of like low-budget films. I've got to say, I thought the first act of this movie was relatively kind of strong. One of the elements that I felt was, and I don't know if this was intentional, I suspect it wasn't, but here it is I really didn't feel this movie had a main character. Instead focusing on the kind of the group and everyone kind of getting equal kind of screen time, and you don't have those typical kind of character dynamics where, you know, you get the kind of the typical a-hole who's going to get eaten first, and you know, all these kind of typical kind of stereotypes. I mean, the characters aren't particularly well drawn out, but they're not these typical archetypes that you see in many films, and there's not really anyone who gets like a significant more amount of screen time than anyone else. So initially you're thinking that it feels more like an ensemble piece to a degree, which makes it quite good because you're not quite sure who's going to kind of like survive, if anyone, out of this movie. So that to me, I mean, you can argue that you don't have anyone to kind of like root behind because the movie doesn't really focus on any particular kind of character, but I actually quite liked it. I have to say, it kind of gave it a little bit more of an exciting, if you can call it that, kind of feel, because you don't really know who's going to kind of make it out and who's going to kind of die. That I thought was quite good. The other aspect in regards to kind of characters that I like is we meet this this kind of poacher character, and again, they don't make him like the typical human antagonist, because a lot of the times in asylum films, to kind of like fit a time away from having to do special effects, which is kind of clearly the most expensive thing, they'll normally have like a kind of a human bad guy to kind of pad out the running time and thus give us a kind of a big storyline, so they don't have to have effects on screen all that often. And I have to say, what we have instead with this one, we have this kind of poacher, and he's somewhat antagonistic, but he's not actually a bad guy. He's not trying to kind of like cause our group of students any real harm. In fact, he's trying to help them to a kind of a certain degree, and he may have told a few porkies about what he knew about the kind of snake, but ultimately I actually found him somewhat of a nuanced character. Can we believe we're saying it's about an asylum film? And I have to say as well, the actor who played that guy, I forget the character's name to be honest, but I actually thought he did a fairly good job. So he, out of all the cast, I think, did a reasonable job in regard to the kind of the acting, and actually felt like, if anything, somewhat of a kind of a reasonably believable kind of character for B-movie standards. But nonetheless, I liked his character. I thought he didn't come across as a typical human bad guy. He seems like, he has different agenda, but it's not necessarily a typical evil, corporate bad guy type thing that they normally have in these films. That I sort of quite liked. And I also like the fact that we see the snake kind of peppered throughout the movie. Sometimes in low budget films you get the kind of the reveal just at the end. They don't do that here. The snake isn't on screen a lot, and we will come on to some issues that are to do with that, but it's a low budget kind of snake movie. It's kind of what you expect for an asylum movie in regards to the effects. I was pleased to see that we do see some other creatures as well. So that was kind of, again, just a little bit of added flavour here. The acting's a bit of a mixed bag. I've already said there's one guy here who I kind of quite liked, and the cast do a mixed job, I would say, but never. I don't think anyone is really terrible in regard to the acting. There's some awful script moments, and I'm going to give you an example of one in a minute. But the acting, saying that, there are a couple of instances where we have like this military woman who I think delivered her lines quite in a clunky manner. But there are other scenes where I think she does okay. So the kind of acting is so-so. The pacing is okay, I think, in this movie. As I say, we have a few kind of like set pieces peppered throughout the film. So let's talk about what doesn't work. Okay. Now, I've mentioned I don't think the acting was terrible, but I think this script here really doesn't help the actors with some terribly written scenes that are badly filmed and badly edited. So I'm just going to give you one example, okay? It's relatively early on. Now, we have Eric Roberts as our kind of our named actor here, but, they had to find a way to kind of sideline him so he's not on screen very much, and most of his scenes are just kind of sitting down. You'll notice a lot of these asylum films, they'll have like Michael Madsen, Tom Sizemore, in this case, Eric Roberts, and most of their scenes will just be them kind of sat down doing something, so there's not a lot of work involved. And that's kind of what happens in here, because we have this Eric Roberts as this professor gets up in the morning and puts his kind of boots on, and there's a spider in his shoe which bites him and poisons him. Now, there's a number of problems with this scene, and this kind of just goes to show you, if I could describe this one scene, about some of the kind of the quick and sloppy writing that we have in a movie like this. So for a start, if you're looking at a kind of a realistic setup of this movie, we are meant to believe that this professor has been doing archaeological expeditions for 20 years. He says as much in the film. And yet he's on a kind of a South American island where his shoes are just out in the grass somewhere, and he doesn't think to kind of like tip his shoes out to make sure nothing's crawled in them. I mean, I've never been to like Australia or anywhere like that, but even I know that that's what you should do, right? So that was silly to begin with. But then just to kind of like demonstrate how poorly this kind of movie kind of does this, he puts his foot in the shoe, and then the spider bites him. So he pulls his foot out the shoe, and yet we see a bite on his kind of like calf. But it's that's not where they, his calf didn't go into this shoe, which was stupid. The spider just crawls out, and surely would have been crushed, but I can kind of forgive that. And then, literally immediately, one of the other students goes, "Oh, it's necrotic," meaning that the flesh around it is dead. I thought, that has literally just happened, like seconds ago. It's not going to be, that kind of like wound. It's not going to be a necrotic wound that quickly. So that whole kind of sequence in regards to, having him, and that was just a plot element to kind of sideline his character, but again, they could have thought of another way to do that. the fact that the wound wasn't even remotely near his foot, the fact that, you know, we're going to have this necrotic wound seconds after it gets bitten. That is like a 5-second screen, and you can see how many kind of like issues there are in that, just that small section. So just kind of imagine that through the whole film. So these films are just kind of knocked out with very little kind of thought for logic, plot holes, things like that. And that's true of many asylum films and many low-budget films, but it's true of this one, so I have to kind of point it out. So this movie is kind of full of kind of plot holes, full of kind of silliness. The second act of this movie, again, and I've mentioned this because we don't want to have our snake on screen all that often because that's expensive. The second act of this movie, the middle portion, is just our characters arguing which way to go in the woods. It is a completely filler sort of section of the movie. It literally doesn't progress the plot anywhere, and we end up at the same kind of point again after this kind of pointless exercise of these guys kind of arguing, and then the snake gets kind of like tranquilized and is kind of a, you know, out of action for like a good portion of the movie. So, you know, they find ways to kind of always stretch out the running time of this movie without having to kind of splash out on effects. Now, you knew this kind of thing was going to happen with these type of films, but it's just a little bit kind of on the nose at times about what's kind of going on. So I thought the movie's first act started well. I thought the second act was kind of a waste of time. And then the third act just gets a little bit kind of like silly and kind of like a little bit kind of too overly kind of CGI and just ridiculous kind of physics and things like this. And it kind of feels like it's just typical kind of like, as I say, mid-2000s CGI kind of monster fare. It doesn't really have any type of real flavour to itself. I think the other, just going back to a positive, I suppose, I mean, this is a huge snake, but I prefer this than the kind of like the kind of the ones that you see that are going through a city and all that kind of stuff. I mean, yeah, it's big, and at the end of it, it gets kind of like ridiculously big, but at least it's kind of exaggerated, but not like ridiculously. Well, it is ridiculous, but you know where I'm going with this one. It's just like a kaiju kind of sized monster, at least not until right at the end. Overall, it's a fairly kind of like what you'd expect from the asylum. I do think there is some entertainment value. I actually quite liked the kind of the characters and the way that they were portrayed here, though I don't know if that was actually intentional, just the kind of the way it kind of turned out necessarily. I'm not really sure if it was meant to have a kind of a central character. It didn't really feel like that. But I actually think that worked in the movie's strength. But it's not a good movie. It's not even an average movie. It's a below average, but not terrible film. So this one I'm going to give a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.